Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first educational session for the CCMTA conference. My name is Amy Miller. I'm BC's board representative on CCMTA, and I am the Assistant Deputy Minister with Road Safety BC and Superintendent of Motor Vehicles. It's a mouthful. I'm not yet done. It's with the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General. We are here today for two speakers. We've got Bryce Doyle and Valerie Smith who will be joining us. We'll be here for about an hour. At the end of each presentation, there will be an opportunity for audience members to pose questions. If you can, we'd ask that you come up to the microphones posed very generously in the middle of the conference floor for everyone. And there will be presentations, and I believe the presentations will be available afterwards as well for folks. So I'm going to start off with Valerie Smith. Valerie Smith is from Parachute. She's the Director of Road Safety Programs. She oversees and manages all of Parachute's road safety and safety mobility initiatives. She also helps to support and mobilize Parachute's Vision Zero network, made up from stakeholders across Canada. Through the implementation of Vision Zero and the Safe Systems approach, she has worked with members of all levels of government. She also works with municipal governments in their adoption of Vision Zero and sits on several Vision Zero committees at the municipal level. She continues to spread awareness and advocates for road safety by responding to media interviews, presenting at national and international conferences. So welcome, Valerie.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to CCMTA and to our host province for bringing us in. Really excited to be here. This is my first in-person CCMTA conference, but I have presented at some open and closed meetings for CCMTA. And I was just chatting with this group up here about the next iteration of the Canada's Road Safety Strategy. And so I think this presentation will be really relevant as I'm going to be speaking to a lot of the changes that we're seeing in the road safety sector in how we use our roads, how we're building our roads, and things are evolving so quickly. It's really hard to keep up with everything. So hopefully you'll find my presentation interesting and helpful. Okay. Where do I click here? There we go. Okay, so today I'm going to talk briefly about the cost of injury report in Canada that was produced by Parachute. I'll talk about its connection to transport injuries and death. And then we're going to look at the Global Decade of Action for Road Safety, 2021 to 2030. I'll also speak a little bit about the global plan that was developed that accompanies it. I'm going to talk about how Parachute and the Canadian Association for Road Safety Professionals and other national, provincial, and territorial groups are going to be working together to make the global plan more tangible in a Canadian context. Okay, and for those of you, can I just get a hand raise for people who have heard of Parachute? Okay, that's good. A little bit more brand recognition. For those of you who haven't heard of us, we are a national charity dedicated to injury prevention and saving lives. Our area of work is really dictated by the data and the trends we see in injury in Canada. That more or less tells us how we're going to do our work and what we're going to focus on. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about the cost of injury report in Canada. So in 2021, this was the second of its kind, and it was done in collaboration with the BC Injury Prevention Institute, as well as the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Conference Board of Canada. The report presents data of all injuries at the national level from the year 2018, and that's because we have that 3-year gap in national injury reporting. It speaks to the human cost of injury, total direct and indirect cost of injury and death in 2018, the cost by cause of injury, and it looks specifically at the highest cost of injury within falls and transport. It's a really important report as it helps those working in the field of injury prevention and in road safety to help build a case for change, appealing to both the human loss and the economic and societal loss. Okay, so on a broader level, for those of you who don't know, injuries are the #1 cause of death for the ages 1 to 44. It's also the 3rd leading cause of death overall in Canada. The top 4 injury causes are falls, suicide and self-harm, unintentional poisoning, and transport deaths. The total cost of injury in 2018 was $29.4 billion. The total direct cost of $20.4 billion directly translates to about $56 million a day spent by the Canadian healthcare system. That obviously could be allocated to other needs in the system. In 2018, transport was the 4th highest cause of death. Catastrophic transport injuries were ranked 2nd. And for the first time, unintentional poisoning has surpassed transport as the 3rd leading cause of injury death. Poisoning deaths have actually doubled since 2010, and that's mainly due to the fentanyl crisis. So here we can see the cost of transport injuries is also staggering. So $3.6 billion. And of course, we all understand that those impacted directly by the loss of loved ones is absolutely unacceptable. So I won't go too much more into this report, but it's a really well done, extensive report. It breaks down age, types of road collisions, and the economic cost associated at the national level, and it's available on our website. Okay, so this brings us to the global plan and the global decade of action. We know road crashes cause nearly 1.3 million preventable deaths and an estimated 50 million injuries each year. It's the leading killer of children and young people worldwide. So recognizing the importance of this problem, governments from around the world, including Canada, declared unanimously through the UN General Assembly resolution a 2nd decade of action for road safety, 2021 to 2030, with the explicit target to reduce death and injuries by 50%. To guide the resolution, the United Nations and the World Health Organization developed an implementation guide, which was meant to support countries as they rolled out the decade. The global plan is aimed at senior policymakers, and it's meant to act as a blueprint for the development of national and regional plans. It's also meant to be used by other folks working in the sector who might influence road safety decisions. It rejects business as usual and calls on all governments and stakeholders to take a new path, one that prioritizes and implements an integrated safe system approach. So as I'm talking about the plan today, you're going to see lots of clear alignments and connections to the Canada National Road Safety Strategy 2025. Okay, I'm just going to play a short little video. This was produced by the Global Alliance of NGOs for Road Safety. They are the leading body responsible for working with all the countries who signed on to the Global Decade to help us continue the work in our own countries on the global plan. Okay, let's see if this works. There, oops. Stand by.
Even though it's a 10-year target, there is not a moment to lose. We have had enough of talking, and now it's time to act.
Destine presupuesto, el cual es un gran mensaje establecido en este plan mundial publicado recientemente por la Organización Mundial de Salud y la ONU.
Involucrar a las ONGs puede ayudar a acelerar el progreso hacia los objetivos 2030, porque somos los ojos, somos los oídos y las voces de las comunidades de todo el mundo. Ofrecemos una perspectiva centrada en las personas.
Malaysia has adopted a National Road Safety Plan 2022-2030, setting a target to reduce fatalities and serious injuries by 50%.
We support my ministry's position to prioritize and implement an integrated safe system.
شهر ایمنی رو برای کاربران راه از جمله آورده پیاده، متوسط رسانان، شهرسازان و تمامی عزیزانی که از راههای شهری استفاده می‌کنن ان شاءالله فراهم کنیم در تهیه بشه.
No hay política pública sin la participación de la sociedad civil.
Pour l'adoption d'une méthode participative à travers l'implication de la société civile et des organisations non gouvernementales pour la réalisation des objectifs communs.
El mundo cambió y la complejidad que tienen los problemas, como por ejemplo la seguridad vial, requiere de trabajo y articulación entre los gobiernos y la ciudadanía.
Okay. Yeah, so for a lot of those countries that were profiled in the video, the safe systems approach is very new to them. We know that within the Canada's Road Safety Strategy 2025, the safe system was implemented and integrated into it. But yeah, for many of these countries, it wasn't, and so it's a very new concept for them to be grasping. So this is a really great visual of the global plan. I use it in most of the presentations I do, and it just gives you a good idea of what the global plan is about, what we are being asked to do within the Global Decade of Action, how to do it, and who's to do it, who are the players involved in it. And then in the one corner, you can see the safe system approach. So as I said, the safe system approach is integral to the Global Decade of Action for Road Safety. And again, that puts Canada a little bit further ahead because we are already doing a lot of work around Vision Zero within our provinces and cities. Okay. So what is needed to reach the target? So the first point, multimodal transport and land use planning. This is really interesting because it's new to this decade of action. It was not in the previous decade. It's emphasized in this global plan. And it was added because of the changing environment of transport. And it assumes that 70% of the global population will be living in urban areas by 2030. So there's a real need to balance transport options with the use of space for healthier cities. The plan establishes the ideal mix of motorized and non-motorized transport options to ensure safe and equitable access to mobility, while also responding to diverse needs of populations. It also emphasizes the need, when we talk about road safety, to really move beyond talking about vehicle collisions. We need to consider all diverse modes that we are increasingly interacting with. And we're going to hear more and more about these different multi-modes of transport, especially in urban areas. Additionally, the global plan is aligned with other sustainable development goals that seek to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and our reliance on fossil fuels. We heard a little bit about this in one of the morning remarks. For example, in Canada, transportation is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, contributing 25% of all emissions. Of these emissions, passenger road transport contributes nearly half, and it largely comes from urban centers. So climate activists for years have been working on advocating for mitigation methods, such as municipal transport systems that shift towards multimodal. Active transport provides better public transit and auto sharing to reduce solo car rides. They've also been working to increase the share of zero emission or fuel efficient vehicles in Canada. And finally, they've been working on policies to reduce carbon intensity of existing fleets of vehicles, including light and heavy freight. So we've got climate activists doing all sorts of work that are also co-benefiting the work we're doing in road safety, also co-benefiting the work we're doing in public health. So there's a lot of intersections that I think we're going to start seeing more and more of. Of the methods to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from road transport, multimodal transport is a particular interest, and this is due to the goals and shared benefits for climate action and for these other sectors. The second component is safe road infrastructure. So improved and evolving infrastructure is essential to reduce road crashes, especially as advocates are pushing for more multimodal transport. There's pedestrians, there's cyclists, now there's people on e-scooters, e-bikes. We've got people using mobility aids, wheelchairs. trucks, cars. There's so many different modes of transport interacting with each other that we need to start considering in how we're building our roads. Rural roads, intersection, and highways must also be considered in terms of how different vehicles interact and use the roads, modes of traffic, median separation of high-speed traffic as well. Safe cars. So vehicles should be designed to ensure the safety of those inside and outside the car. The global plan also talks a lot about emerging technologies and opportunities within AV. Safe road use. So the old behaviors that we keep seeing still exist. Speeding, impaired driving, driver fatigue, distracted driving, and non-compliance with child restraints and safety belts are among some of the key behaviors leading and continuing to lead road injury and death. So that's where legislation, enforcement, and education continue to be prominent in the safe systems approach. Okay, so as we're talking about these different sections in the global plan, you'll also be thinking a little bit about where the different levels of government in Canada interact with some of these components. So the global plan talks about how to do it. So financing, we know road safety is underfunded in almost every single country. We hear this from our partners working at the provincial and territorial level, as well as municipal government. Long-term sustainable investment is required for the development of safe road infrastructure, as well as for interventions that can improve road safety. In the guide, there's a lot of talk as well about leveraging funding through groups doing work in the space of climate action, public health, city planning, and mobility. Legislation is hugely important, as we all know, especially around speed enforcement and compliant, policy changes based on evidence-based recommendations, and the use of automated speed enforcement. Speed management, we're going to be hearing a lot about this as well. This is a consistent deliverable we're seeing amongst all countries that are taking part in the global decade. It's something we know works. It's a cross-cutting risk factor, and it's addressed through actions relating to different elements, such as multimodal transport, how we build our cities, climate action, vehicle design, and road user behavior. We know appropriate speed management impacts the effectiveness of and impacts crash likelihood and severity. For example, in densely populated urban areas, we know that the speed limit reduced to 30 kilometers an hour will absolutely help to ensure the safety of all road users. Capacity development and gender considerations are also very integrated into the plan, so ensuring a gender perspective in transport is needed. We know men and women use the roads differently and transport options differently, especially public transit. There's a large focus on low and middle income countries. Low and middle income countries account for over 90% of severe injuries and death, yet they only have 60% of the world's vehicles. So the Global Decade of Action really looks at some capacity building countries like Canada can do with other countries. Okay, so who's involved in the global plan? Government agencies have the primary responsibility to design a safe road transport system and implement a road safety action plan. However, this global decade and the global plan really, as you saw from the video, encourages the role of NGOs and other civil society actors in the rollout of the strategies. There's a very strong and influential role for groups like Parachute, CARSP, TAC, ITE, and all the other NGOs working on the ground. Advocates, activists, private sector, there's a very big role for the private sector. We know corporations and businesses have tremendous influence on transport systems through both their products and their fleets and how they move their employees around the roads. There's also the potential for financial support through some of these private companies. So these slides are just some photos that were taken at the 8th Global Meeting recently in El Salvador. Myself, Mavis from CARSP, and Bella from Traffic Injury Research Foundation attended. It was really great to work with all these other advocates. There were a number of other NGOs who had started in a number of these countries because they had lost family members. So activists as well as government and larger NGOs. Okay, so I'm going to skip these slides. I don't have enough time. Okay, so call to action. So in late 2022, Parachute was asked by the Global Alliance of NGOs for Road Safety to take a lead in developing a North American call to action focused on the plan with colleagues from the United States. We also received input from groups like TURF and CARSP, and the call was essentially to look at the global plan, but look at how we can contextualize it in Canada, how we can build Canadian data into it and make it something that's more integrated into the work we're doing. And in discussions with Brad and CCMTA, it's our hope to really integrate and align the global plan with the next iteration of the road safety strategy coming out of the CCMTA. The call to action specifically speaks to evidence-based actions. So we saw that in the video, a call for government to implement safe system approach in traffic safety and mobility at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels. There's a need for us to integrate road safety directly into the public health agendas, into urban development, and mobility planning. And in countries that already have a national road safety strategy, like Canada, there's a need for greater and consistent implementation, collaboration, and ongoing revisiting of the plan to ensure the plan's evolving with the complex structure we're faced with right now. There's a need to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into all road safety planning, ensuring that the roads and other public spaces are equitable and safe for everyone. So in the call to action for North America specifically, we want to look at ways to implement active transport and multimodal transportation options with a focus on protecting vulnerable road users. And when we talk about vulnerable road users in the plan, we aren't just specifically talking about children or seniors, pedestrians and cyclists. We're talking about people living in marginalized communities and low-income communities. So we need to promote and make multiple forms of transportation available equitably, focusing on low-income neighborhoods, ensuring they have the same quality of available transportation and road systems as high-income neighborhoods. We need to build regular, frequent public transport with accessible timetables, adequate and well-maintained infrastructure, and ideally these changes will enable road users to start making some of that shift out of their cars to a multimodal option. And speed management, guidelines, policies, and regulations are very strong in the call to action. And then involving civil society in decision-making process. So here, establishing clear mechanisms, such as formal committees, at the federal, provincial, territory, and municipal levels, where civil society organizations like Parachute, like some of the others I mentioned, work very closely with the government in the design of their national road safety strategies. How's my time? Okay. So how's Parachute supporting the Global Decade of Action? So Parachute's actually working hand in hand with the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals and a number of other organizations to build awareness on the Global Decade amongst all levels of government. We're meeting with stakeholders, we're meeting with government to talk about the decade, to ensure varying levels of government understand what it is, what Canada signed on for, and how the different levels of government have a role to play within the global plan. So 2022 was dedicated to raising awareness on the plan amongst NGOs and other stakeholders. We did a series of webinars. We've had a series of meetings with different folks at government level, and we're going to continue to collaborate and positively engage with federal, provincial, municipal governments and legislators on the plan. The global plan, as you may have noticed through the discussion, is primarily designed to cater to countries that operate under a unified jurisdiction where all road safety responsibilities are consolidated. So we do recognize Canada's governance structure is different and it's complex. We've got federal, provincial, territorial jurisdictions, we've got municipal responsibilities, and so there's going to be a real need in order to actually implement and integrate pieces of the global plan into the next road safety strategy. There's a real need to kind of find those intersections and how each level of government can potentially work with each other. Parachute and CARSP have also recently agreed to lead a national coalition that's going to bring together organizations, not just from the road safety space, but from climate action groups, urban and sustainability planning, cycling, and other mobility advocates to discuss the intersections between our work and plan for collaboration to make us for a stronger voice. We're going to be looking for connections between the National Active Transport Strategy as well as the Canada's Action Plan on Clean Road Transportation. And one area, as I said, that we're really hoping to build some consensus around is speed reduction. Okay, so wrapping up, one more piece I just want to mention is we believe at Parachute that it's very important to gain the public support around changing the behavior on our roads, around changing road culture. We work very hard to not use the word accident in our dialogue. We work very hard with media across the country to encourage them not to use the word accident, because it really pulls away from the responsibility of the road system, of the road user. Most crashes and collisions aren't accidents, they're predictable and preventable. So this is a really big piece, and we would hope it would be an easy win, because without changing the culture of the Canadian public, we're not going to have that pressure and advocacy to encourage our governments to do more. And finally, we continue to do a lot of work on Vision Zero. We work with provinces and municipalities to offer support as they start their road, their journey to Vision Zero. We have a document called the Canadian Landscape on Vision Zero, where we highlight any provinces that have adopted it, as well as all municipalities that have adopted Vision Zero. It's a great document. It looks at, we interview up to 5 key informants in each city and province, and we talk about opportunities and challenges, what worked, what didn't within Vision Zero. And we also run a very big public awareness campaign, leveraging all the social media, digital ads, and so forth, again, just trying to build that momentum in the public. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Up next, we have Bryce Dole. Bryce is the manager of road safety programs and analysis with Manitoba Public Insurance and is a member of the CCMTA Road Safety Research and Policy Committee. In his role at MPI, Bryce is responsible for leading a team of road safety professionals who conduct research and analysis to understand road safety issues in Manitoba and develop policy and programming to address them. Bryce has a background in data analysis and is passionate about uncovering and applying data-driven insights to develop more effective road safety initiatives. Thank you, Bryce.
Okay, thank you, Amy. And maybe before I get started, I'll grab the clicker from you, Valerie. Yep, so thanks for that, Amy. I'm here today to talk about a pilot project that we ran in Manitoba of a virtual driving assessment. So you can think of it just like a computer-based road test. But before I get into that, I'll give you a little bit of outline of what we're going to cover. I'll give you an explanation of how things work in Manitoba. For those of you who aren't familiar with the intricacies of Manitoba, I'll explain that a little bit. I'll get into the reason why we decided to do the pilot, how we designed it, and then we'll get into the good stuff, which is what we actually found and kind of the relationship between how people performed on a virtual driving assessment versus a real-world road test. But first, for those who aren't familiar with how things work in Manitoba, a little bit of information. So MPI is the Crown Corporation provider of basic auto insurance in Manitoba. So we do it all at MPI. We do insurance, registration, licensing, and we've got a strong road safety mandate as well. So what that means is that most Manitobans are customers of MPI for life. So we'll interact with you first when you're in elementary school to do programming to teach you how to ride a bike safely around vehicles. We'll be there with your driver education when you're 15, get your first license, get your vehicle registered. Hopefully you never make a mistake and get in a collision, but if you do, we're also there to process your claim, get your car fixed, and get you back healthy and back to normal life. So I mentioned all this really for a couple main reasons. One is that MPI is really deeply invested in our customers in a way that not every insurance company is, clearly. Because of our road safety mandate and because we insure every single driver that we license, we've got some really, really strong incentives to make sure that when we put someone on the road, they're safe and prepared to do so. And that brings me to kind of why we decided to run this pilot, because we kind of saw this new technology, this new innovation, as a way to see, can we assess drivers differently and earlier on before they even ever get into a car. to understand kind of the impetus for why we decided to do the pilot, it's first kind of useful to understand that we've got kind of two broad groups of customers. So we can call them essentially the unprepared and the reasonably prepared. So right now, most drivers would come in prepared to pass their road test. Maybe they make a mistake or two, but they're passing within 1 or 2 attempts. They get their license and they're on their way. Everybody's happy. We do have a second group we can call the unprepared. These are people who may come in to do a road test. Unfortunately, they don't pass it. Maybe they go away, they take some more training, practice with a supervising driver, but unfortunately they get caught in the cycle where they come and they fail, and they practice and they fail again, which isn't good for anybody, obviously. So what we want to see, what we can do with the virtual assessment is, can we assess driver ability before they ever actually get in the vehicle and do a road test? Now, the one kind of real important reason for this is that we know that people who tend to take more road tests tend to get in more collisions. And this goes to the question you asked earlier, when we've got that life cycle of someone, we can understand these things. So if we can figure that out sooner, that they've got some issues, it's kind of a win for everybody. So for the reasonably prepared, they have more tests available to them because the unprepared aren't taking up all the tests when they're not quite ready to go. And another benefit for them as well is, of course, is they get to share the road with people who are prepared to drive safely in their communities. Now, for those who are unprepared, if they can identify where their deficiencies are earlier on, then it's a benefit for them as well. They can understand them, work with us to correct them, and then they can avoid kind of that endless cycle of testing that's not enjoyable for anybody. So I've talked a little bit about a virtual assessment. I'm sure you're all wondering, what exactly are we talking about? So basically what it is, it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's a simulated environment where someone sits down at a desk, they've got a computer monitor in front of them, steering wheel and pedals, and they drive their way through a computer simulated world that's just like the one they would encounter in real life. They have instructions presented to them on screen and by audio, telling them, take a left turn here, right turn here, straight through there. And it's meant to kind of represent as much as possible what it's like to drive a car in real life. And the great thing about it is it kind of puts drivers through all sorts of different driving scenarios. So you have your basics, stopping at a red light or a stop sign, but we can have some more kind of unexpected things happen as well. So an emergency vehicle passes them. They would have maybe a school bus that's loading up children. Maybe one of the kids decides to run across the street chasing after a ball. In a virtual assessment, we can put drivers through all different types of situations like this. The computer is assessing in the background how they're doing. At the end of the day, it spits out an error score that tells us an assessment of their driving ability. So I'll skip through things here quickly in the interest of time, but just the one point I'm meant to make here is that when we're doing a road test, we're testing for different levels of skill, right? So can you turn a vehicle on? Can you put it in drive and so forth? But where a virtual driving assessment comes in really handy is with some of those higher level critical thinking skills. So when you see that emergency vehicle pass you, are you able to change your plan, adapt your driving behavior accordingly, and operate the vehicle more safely? You could have things as well, like someone passing them at a high rate of speed. Now, hopefully that never happens to someone on a road test, but it's something they're going to encounter at some point in life driving by. What we really liked about a virtual assessment is we can really put drivers through the ringer in a way that's simply not possible on a road test. So we're not going to have an endless string of high danger situations put in front of someone on a road test. That would be a terrible idea for everybody involved, but we can do it virtually, and we can get a good assessment. That was one of the things that we found really valuable as part of the pilot. So I'll just give you a quick snapshot here what this actually looks like for somebody. So this is what it looks like for a customer who's actually sitting down at the desk. So like I said, very simple setup. They've got a monitor in front of them, steering wheel, pedals, and they're driving along, their changes being shown up on screen, and all that input's being fed in and assessed as they're driving along in that actual environment. So that's what it looks like from the customer perspective. In the background, we're gathering a lot of useful information about how safely they're handling that environment. Okay, so on to the actual pilot now. So we had kind of 4 main things that we were looking to figure out, 4 main objectives as part of the actual pilot. So objective number 1 is we wanted to determine whether a virtual driving assessment was feasible to integrate into our operations. So If we had a 4-hour assessment, that's the greatest assessment in the world, that would be great, but we're probably not going to ask people to come in and spend half their day at an MPI service center taking a virtual assessment. So we need it to be quick. We need people to be able to see right away, be able to assess their driving ability quickly. The second element of this one is we wanted to have it available all the time when customers needed it. So this is more kind of a technological thing, but the idea is that when a customer comes in, it was up and ready for them to use. So that was kind of question number one that we wanted to answer. The second question, and this was a big one for us, was whether customers thought it was a realistic representation of the road. So going into it, we were a little bit hesitant about this one. We anticipated that a lot of people were going to kind of dismiss it out of hand, say this is just kind of like some silly video game, or this isn't what it's actually like to drive on the road, and they just wouldn't take it seriously. We were a little bit worried that was going to be the case, but so we wanted to test it. We included that as part of the survey that we did as part of our pilot. The third question was whether a virtual driving assessment can avoid making drivers feel motion sickness. Now, we've got a pretty bright group of people in the room. Does anyone know the #1 rule of customer service? That's right. Most people say it's the customer's always right, but no, the #1 rule is don't make your customers vomit. Yeah, so I kid, but it actually was a consideration, right? So beside the obvious reason that we don't want to make our customers sick, it's also not fair as part of the assessment, right? So someone who's feeling nausea or dizziness isn't going to drive well for reasons totally unrelated to their actual driving ability. So that's one that we wanted to capture as well as part of our survey questions. And finally, this is a really big one. This is what it all hinges on, is whether this virtual assessment is predictive of their actual on-road road test performance. So basically, if you drive safely in this virtual environment, do you then proceed to pass the road test at a higher rate, and vice versa? If you're hitting into cars, running red lights in a virtual assessment, do you then fail the road test at a higher rate? And that was kind of the key question that everything turned on. So in terms of how we actually set the pilot up, there's kind of a few important things. So we ran it in 5 locations across the province, trying to get 500 people to both complete the virtual assessment and then go on and complete a road test. We ran it, of course, in both official languages so that people could take it in the language of their choosing. And all those kind of efforts were to make sure that we got a representative sample of Manitobans. I touched on the participant survey a little bit already, but this was a really important one for us because it goes beyond just the pure mathematical effectiveness of the thing. We had to understand as well people's experiences with it, and we captured that information with the survey that everybody completed at the end. And finally, kind of the last important piece from an analytical perspective is that we did have a link between the virtual assessment outcomes and road test outcomes. Now, the people involved were totally blinded to it, so no one involved had any idea of how they performed on the virtual assessment. But in the background, we were linking this up so that we could do that analysis afterwards to see the relationship between virtual and real world. So I'll touch on this just very quickly. I don't want to keep anyone into lunch, but just I think it's important to understand things from the driver's perspective as well. So it's a pretty standard process in Manitoba. You take a knowledge test, book your road test. Then when you're ready to take your road test, you'd come into a service center location, and that's where the virtual assessment would come in. So we offered on a completely voluntary basis that anyone who'd like to participate could. We'd explain the pilot, here's what we're trying to do, why we're doing it. But the important thing was that it was up to them whether they wanted to participate, totally optional, and it would have no impact whatsoever on their road test. So we didn't share results with either the participant themselves or with the driver examiner who's actually conducting the road test. The idea being that we didn't want to impact the actual road test in any way possible to make sure that we got nice and pure data. So other than that 15 minutes that it kind of takes the customer to complete the virtual driving assessment, their experience was totally not impacted. Okay, so on to the good stuff now in terms of what we actually discovered. So you'll recall we had kind of 4 questions that we were looking to answer with it. The first is whether it's feasible to integrate into our operations. And really what we looked at here was 2 things. So was it quick? How long did it take people to actually get through? And number 2, was it reliable? So when they came in to do the assessment, were they actually able to do it? And we had really good results here. So 3/4 of customers only took 50 minutes to complete it, which is great. That's not a big chunk of time out of their day. And for us operationally, that's something that we're able to handle without impacting a lot of other customers as well as they go about their day. And then the second one was excellent, obviously. We had 100% uptime on the actual assessment, so when drivers came in to do the pilot, it was there and ready for them to use. So a big green check for feasibility. We did find it to be quite quick and easy to integrate into our existing operations. So the second question was about whether this is a realistic representation of the road from the customer's perspective. And you recall we had a little bit of our own hesitation going into it, that people might dismiss it as a video game or so forth. But when we actually asked the people who participated, that's not what we found at all. So when we asked them, did you find these driving situations to be a realistic representation? The overwhelming majority said yes. They agreed with that statement and that it did represent what they experienced on the road. As I mentioned, this was a little bit a surprise for us. It was a pleasant surprise to be sure, but we expected a little bit more resistance to new technology than what we found. We can leave that up for commentary on whether that's a societal adoption of new technology or just these people in particular, but it was a really positive finding from our perspective that they did accept this. So again, we were able to answer that question successfully, and it kind of exceeded beyond our expectations as well, what customers' perceptions of it would be. Third question, again, was does the assessment cause motion sickness? So you recall, that's the #1 rule of customer service. Don't make your customers sick. And we'd be happy to report that didn't happen. When we asked this question, we found that most people experienced no nausea or dizziness whatsoever. We did have a very small number who did experience it in a significant way. But we do kind of urge a little bit of caution in interpreting the results, because we were very conservative in the way we asked the question. We were essentially leading people to accept that they felt nausea or dizziness. But we were trying to be conservative and make sure that we didn't underestimate the impact it was having on people. But in the end, we kind of saw exactly what we were hoping for. We didn't make our customers sick. They thought it was realistic. So from a customer experience perspective, it ended up being really quite positive. Okay, so that leaves us with kind of the most important question. So the first three are great, but it all kind of hinges on whether this virtual assessment is predictive of the actual road test in Manitoba. So the first thing we need to look at as part of that is how did people actually end up scoring on this virtual assessment? So this is what that looks like. So just a quick explainer of what we're looking at. We've got the error score in the virtual assessment kind of along the bottom. So as you go from left to right, you're going from drivers who did the best to the worst, so safest drivers to least safest drivers. And I know we all think we're perfect drivers. Well, maybe not. Maybe in this room we understand the risks, but most people we talk to think they're perfect. There are 1% of people who actually somehow didn't make a single error. These people do exist, believe it or not, but they're clearly the exception. But what's really important to notice here is that if you recall from earlier, we kind of group people into two groups, right? So the reasonably prepared and the unprepared. And when we look at how people performed on this virtual assessment, we kind of start to see that same pattern here. So we see that most people tended to do pretty well. So they didn't really make a lot of errors. Maybe they let their speed creep up on them here and there. Maybe they didn't quite navigate a right-hand turn perfectly. But by and large, they performed pretty well. On the other hand, we do have that smaller subset of drivers who were assessed to have a higher error score, so they assessed to be navigating these situations more poorly than the rest. So if we take, for example, the group who had a score of 50 plus, we would call these kind of the bottom 12% of drivers who the virtual assessment says is kind of the most risky. So what we would expect to see if the virtual assessment is predictive is that the people who did really well, so the people on the left hand of the chart, should be passing the road test at a fairly high rate, and we should see that go down as we get to the worst and worst drivers on the right-hand side. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what we ended up seeing. So the perfect drivers, those people who somehow scored 0 on the error score, had the highest road test pass rate, and we see kind of a steady decrease as we go to those groups of drivers who made more and more mistakes. So basically, if someone who makes very few mistakes on the virtual assessment, it turns out that they then go on to pass the road test at a fairly high rate. So that would be kind of a successful identification of that reasonably prepared group. And then the opposite of that, as we go down, we see that the people who scored really poorly on the virtual assessment have very, very low road test rates. So to us, this is a confirmation that yes, this virtual assessment is an accurate predictor of someone's likelihood to fail a road test. So in summary, like I said, we've got 4 questions. We were able to answer them all. So number 1, we found it to be feasible to integrate into operations. It's quick and reliable. Secondly, people thought it was a realistic representation of the road. So they didn't think it was a video game. They thought it was a realistic and reliable piece of technology. Third, we didn't violate the number 1 rule of customer service. We didn't make anyone sick. And fourth, and most importantly, is that we did find it to be predictive of someone's road test outcomes. So that leaves us where we are now. We've taken kind of our pilot here, we've assessed the results, and we found that we were able to answer questions in the way we hoped. Now, what we're doing is we're looking at our own operational workflows, looking at the results of the pilot, and we're kind of assessing the different ways that we can integrate virtual assessment into some of our operations. So that's it for me.
Great, and with that, I'm gonna wish you all of freedom in a couple quick seconds here. I'm just gonna quickly wrap up. So again, I just wanna thank Valerie and Bryce for their participation. Thank everyone here for your participation in the discussion. Your ability to provide feedback would also be really appreciated, so please let CCMTA folks here know. We're going to break for lunch until 1:30, and I encourage everyone to attend our second session today. So it's a panel discussion called Understanding Labor Market Challenges in Trucking, Identifying Opportunities for Increased Collaboration. You can get more details about that session on your app, and just as a reminder that this session was recorded, the information and videotaping and presentations will be available pretty quickly after this. So thanks everyone, enjoy your lunch.